Jacob Miller had long stopped expecting miracles ever since the day the doctors told him his wife had just weeks to live and everything in his world collapsed with the force of a silent hurricane. No one else could feel but him and his little girl, Lily, who at 7 years old had learned more about grief and strength than most adults ever would. And now, 2 years later, in the frostbitten quiet of Maple Ridge, a sleepy town on the edge of forgotten woods and snowbound mountains, Jacob found himself barely scraping by, working part-time odd jobs, repairing fences and patching roofs for people who could barely pay him, relying on the kindness of neighbors and the meager savings his wife left behind to keep the cabin warm and food on the table. And even then, most nights he went without dinner so Lily wouldn't have to know what hunger truly felt like, wrapping her up in wool blankets as they read bedtime stories by candlelight when the generator sputtered out, pretending everything was okay while the cold bit into his bones and loneliness gnawed at his soul. It was on one of those bleak evenings, as the wind howled like wolves and snow fell in thick, silent sheets, that a sudden knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts, causing Lily to look up from her coloring book with wide eyes as Jacob cautiously approached the door, heart thudding with a mixture of fear and confusion, because no one ever knocked this far out. Not unless something was very wrong. When he opened it, the last thing he expected was to see a young woman, barely out of her teens, drenched in snow, cheeks raw from the cold, eyes full of desperation, whispering, "Please, I just need a place to warm up, just for tonight." And though Jacob should have said no, should have turned her away, like any cautious father might, he looked into her eyes and saw something hauntingly familiar, something broken and raw, the same look his wife had in the hospital when she thought Lily wasn't watching. And before he could think better of it, he stepped aside and let the stranger in, offering her a towel and a spot near the heater, telling Lily it was okay, and watching as his daughter, ever her mother's child, offered the girl a cup of hot water and her favorite stuffed rabbit to hold. The girl's name, she said, was Ellie, and she claimed she'd been hitchhiking, lost on the roads, trying to get away from everything. And Jacob didn't press for more, didn't ask where she was from or who she was running from, because some people carried stories too heavy to unpack all at once. And he knew better than anyone that sometimes silence was the only way to heal. That first night, she slept on the couch, wrapped in every blanket they had. And in the morning, instead of leaving, she offered to help chopping firewood with surprising skill, fixing the broken hinge on Lily's toy chest, even baking cornbread, using an old recipe she said her grandmother used to make, and little by little, she started to fit into their quiet life, like she'd always been meant to, making Lily laugh again. Helping Jacob breathe a little easier, and, for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so hollow. But even as the days passed and Ellie stayed, something about her didn't add up. Her boots were too new, her coat too expensive despite its dirt. And once Jacob caught her staring too long at the faded family photo on the mantel. Her eyes, glassy with emotion, she quickly hid. And when he asked about her family, she simply said, "They wouldn't care if I died," then changed the subject so fast he didn't have the heart to ask again. Still, he noticed things, the way she spoke French in her sleep, the calluses on her fingers that didn't match the softness of her voice, the way she flinched whenever a car passed by on the road outside, and, though he tried not to worry, part of him began to fear she was in more trouble than she let on, especially after the black SUV appeared one morning, creeping slowly past the cabin with tinted windows and city plates, pausing just long enough to send a chill down his spine before disappearing into the trees again. And when he told Ellie, she froze like a deer in headlights, locking herself in the bathroom for nearly an hour before emerging with a smile, too forced to be real, insisting she was fine, just tired. Maybe it was someone else, and Jacob didn't push because he knew fear when he saw it, and he wasn't about to send her back into it. What he didn't expect was how quickly Lily bonded with Ellie, calling her big sister and asking if she could stay forever, clinging to her hand during walks and begging her to braid her hair like she used to do with her mom and Jacob, watching them from the porch as snowflakes danced in the air. Felt something stir inside him, something fragile and terrifying, a hope he hadn't dared feel in years, that maybe, just maybe, their broken little family wasn't so broken anymore. Still, the questions remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind like mice in the walls, especially when he noticed Ellie checking her phone one night. The screen cracked, but the model expensive, and the way she looked at it, like it held both salvation and damnation, made his gut twist. Then one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and the world turned gold and violet, Jacob came home from town to find Ellie gone and Lily sitting alone on the steps, eyes red from crying, holding a crumpled note that simply said, "Thank you for everything, I'm sorry." And in that moment, Jacob felt the air leave his lungs, panic rising like fire as he sprinted down the dirt road, calling her name, searching through the trees until night swallowed the sky. And only when he returned home, defeated, did he find her on the porch, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I tried to go, I really did, but I couldn't leave her. I couldn't leave either of you. And Jacob, without a word, wrapped his arms around her like he hadn't held another soul since the day his wife died. And for the first time since she arrived, Ellie sobbed without restraint, clinging to him like a drowning girl to a life raft. And when Lily peeked out and joined the hug, it felt like the universe itself had paused to let something long broken begin to mend. Jacob knew then, even without answers, that Ellie had become part of their story, messy, complicated, mysterious, but real. And whatever came next, he wouldn't turn her away. Not when she'd already given them more than she knew. Not when the warmth in their cabin was no longer just from the fire, but from something deeper, something finally alive again. The snow began to melt 3 weeks after Ellie returned to the porch, sobbing and unsure. 3 weeks after she nearly ran from the warmth she'd found, and 3 weeks after Jacob decided without ever saying it out loud that he wouldn't ask her to explain her secret, not until she was ready. Because whatever pain she carried wasn't his to demand. And in those days, between late winter and early spring, a strange and beautiful rhythm emerged inside the once quiet cabin, where Ellie began rising early to make breakfast, braiding Lily's hair and teaching her how to make animal shapes out of paper, where laughter began to echo through the walls again. And even Jacob stubborn, grieving, Jacob started humming to himself while fixing broken window frames, as if some part of him remembered how it felt to be alive. But even as that fragile piece grew, Ellie never truly let her guard down, always checking the road before walking out, always sleeping with her phone clutched tight to her chest. And sometimes Jacob would catch her standing by the window at night, staring into the woods as if expecting something or someone to emerge. And it was during one of those nights, as the first thunderstorm of the season rolled in, shaking the cabin with its deep growl, that Jacob finally asked her voice, low but steady, "Who are you really, Ellie?" And for a moment, she didn't move, just kept her eyes fixed outside before whispering, "Someone I don't want to be." And when he waited, silent and patient, she turned to him and said, "I'll tell you everything. Just not yet, I promise." And something in her tone made him believe her. Because it wasn't guilt he saw in her eyes, it was shame, the kind you only carry when your name isn't your own anymore. And so time passed with quiet trust, and the day Ellie taught Lily how to ride a bike using the one Jacob had pieced together from old scrap parts. The girl's shrieks of joy echoed down the dusty lane like music, and Jacob watched them with his arms crossed, a strange ache in his chest that wasn't pain, wasn't grief, it was hope, soft and terrifying in its unfamiliarity. And he almost didn't want to breathe, afraid the spell would break. But the spell did break, not all at once, but in fragments, beginning with a silver car that parked on the outskirts of town strange for Maple Regent, ending with a sheriff knocking at Jacob's door 2 days later with an expression. To come, to be innocent, holding a photo and asking, "Have you seen this girl?" And Jacob, without missing a beat, said no. But when the sheriff left, Ellie collapsed on the couch and said only, "He works for my father." And that night, with rain lashing the windows again like it had that first night, she finally told Jacob the truth, that her real name was Eleanor Whitmore, that her father was Marcus Whitmore, the man who practically owned every building, business, and backroom deal in the town and the 5 surrounding counties. A tycoon whose empire was built not just on money, but power, reputation, and secret sand. She, his only daughter, had grown up in glass castles with iron locks, expected to behave, smile, and marry into alliances like she was a chess piece and not a person. And she did for years, smiling through dinners with senators and heirs, pretending she didn't hear the way her father talked about people like they were property. Until one day she snapped Tran from a party where she was expected to announce her engagement to a man twice her age, fled in a silver dress and boots not meant for walking, hitchhiking from town to town until her phone died and her name stopped feeling real. And somehow she ended up at Jacob's door, freezing, exhausted, terrified, and hoping someone, anyone, would look at her like a human being, not a pawn, not a social symbol, not a key to a fortune, just a girl who was tired of being used. And when she finished speaking, voice cracking but steady, Jacob simply nodded and said, "You can stay." And that was it. No questions, no judgment. Just 3 words that loosened something deep inside her chest. And in the weeks that followed, she began to let go of the fear that clung to her, began to trust the world inside that cabin more than the one she left behind. But the Whitmores did not let go so easily. And as the story of a missing heiress spread across news outlets and social media, as private investigators showed up in town pretending to be cousins or job recruiters, as drones began flying over the ridge where the forest met the Miller property, Ellie knew her time was running out. Jacob did everything he could to keep her safe, built fences, covered windows, taught her and Lily how to sneak out the back if anything ever felt wrong. But even he couldn't stop what came next. Because on the first warm evening of April, a sleek black car pulled up the gravel path, not creeping this time, but roaring like a declaration. And Marcus Whitmore stepped out with 2 suited men beside him, looking not like a worried father, but like a general prepared for war. His eyes scanning the cabin as if measuring it. Then, settling on Ellie as she stepped onto the porch with Lily's hand in hers, the little girl, too young to understand what was happening, but smart enough to know something was wrong. Marcus didn't shout, didn't plead. He simply said, "You've made your point, Eleanor. Now come home." And when Ellie replied, "This is my home now," his jaw clenched, and he said through gritted teeth, "You're embarrassing the family. Okay. You've had your rebellion. Now end it." And when Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between them, Marcus looked him over with quiet disgust and said, "Do you honestly believe she belongs here, with people like you?" And Jacob didn't flinch, didn't argue, "She's safe. That's not with you." And for a second, something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Something not quite anger or fear, but surprise, like no one had ever stood up to him so simply before. And though he threatened lawyers and police and all the power money could buy, Ellie didn't move. And when Lily stepped forward and took her hand and said, "She's our family," something broke in the tension. Something small and invisible, but powerful. And Marcus knew he wouldn't win, not by force, not without destroying whatever fragile illusion of love he once offered. He left without another word, but the air didn't clear immediately. And for weeks afterward, Ellie kept expecting him to return, to drag her back with legal papers or worse. But when nothing came, no lawsuits, no raids, no threats, they began to believe maybe, just maybe, he had let go, or at least realized she couldn't be bought or bullied into returning. And in that aftermath, Jacob saw a new version of Ellie emerge, not just the girl who had knocked on his door for shelter, not just the heiress who'd run from gold and glass, but a woman who wanted to build something real, who fixed up the old barn out back and turned it into a tiny schoolhouse for Lily and the other kids nearby, who started baking bread to sell in town and gave every extra loaf to the neighbors who needed it, who began to plant a garden with Lily's help and painted the cabin walls in colors Jacob never would have dared to choose alone, laughing when he called them sunset vomit, and insisting that joy didn't need to be tastefully, just needed to be felt. And Jacob, watching her flourish, knew something inside him was changing too. That grief was no longer the loudest voice in the room. That maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. And though he never said it, he loved her long before she ever admitted the same. Loved her in the quiet way people do when they're too scared to name what they might lose. Loved her in the way he reached for her hand without thinking, and how she squeezed back like she knew what he meant. And one night, as stars bloomed over the ridge and Lily snored gently in her bed. Ellie sat with Jacob on the porch swing and whispered, "I used to think I had nothing if I gave up the life I was born into. But now I know I had nothing until I did." And he didn't reply, just pulled her close. The sound of frogs and crickets, all the answer they needed. And in that stillness, wrapped in a blanket, hearts against the quiet of the woods, they knew the world had already changed. And no one, not even Marcus Whitmark, could undo it. By the time summer unfurled across Maple Ridge in slow, golden waves, everything that once felt fragile had begun to root itself in permanence. And the cabin that used to echo with silence now breathed with life, its windows open to birdsong, its porch filled with potted plants and muddy shoes, and its kitchen table crowded with laughter and second helpings. Because something had changed between Jacob and Ellie that springs something quiet, something sacred. It wasn't in a kiss or a confession or any one thunderous moment, but rather in the thousand small ones that build up over time. Like bricks, the way she knew exactly how he took his coffee without asking, the way he started setting an extra plate even before she came down the stairs, the way Lily tugged both her hands when crossing the road and said, "Come on, Mom and Dad," without hesitation. And though Ellie always blinked hard when that happened, she never corrected her, and Jacob never did either, because the name didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt earned. People in town started noticing too, not just the way Ellie lit up the farmer's market with her smile, or how Jacob stood taller when she was beside him, but how the old Miller place finally looked lived in again. Alive again, with music floating through the windows and pies cooling on the sill, and Lily chasing chickens barefoot while shouting instructions like a general at war. And though folks whispered about the strange girl who came out of nowhere, Jacob's quiet respect and Ellie's kindness softened even the nosiest tongues. Especially when she began volunteering at the clinic, helping old Miss Duncan with her hearing aid and driving Mr. Riley to church on Sundays in their beat-up pickup. And it wasn't long before Ellie wasn't the girl Jacob took in anymore. She was just Ellie, just one of them, and that small miracle was one she never took for granted. But peace has a way of testing itself, and just as the garden began to bloom, and the bees returned to their hive, and the mornings smelled of dew and promise, another letter arrived, this one not from Marcus Whitmore, but from his lawyer, slick and clinical, stating that Marcus had passed away quietly in his sleep at his estate in Belhurst, that his will had been processed, and that Eleanor Whitmore was now the sole inheritor of a $480 million empire spanning oil, real estate, logistics, and various untouchable shell corporations. And though the paper bore no threats and no demands, it sent Ellie spiraling into a silence Jacob hadn't seen in months. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around her like armor. And when he asked what she was thinking, she simply said, "I don't know who I am anymore." And that night, she didn't sleep, just stared out the window with trembling hands, while Jacob stayed beside her, holding her fingers until dawn cracked over the mountains like a sigh. It wasn't just the money, it was the weight of it, the legacy, the expectation, the return of a name she had worked so hard to shed. And the idea that the past she'd buried was now pounding at the door with legal titles and inheritance papers, and the ghosts of every Whitmore dinner she'd ever had to survive. The next few weeks passed like a storm beneath a calm sky. Lee still laughed with Lily and still kissed Jacob's cheek as she passed him the butter. But something in her eyes had shifted, and Jacob, who knew silence intimately, recognized what it meant. She was trying to decide if staying with them meant betraying who she used to be or who she had become. Then, one day, she packed a bag, not everything, just a few things, said she needed to go to Belhurst to sign the papers in person, just to end it. And Jacob didn't ask her to stay, didn't beg or question or panic. He simply nodded and said, "We'll be right here." And though his voice cracked, she kissed him softly and promised, "I'm not running this time." And Lily hugged her like it was just another trip to town, whispering, "Don't forget my drawings." And Jacob watched from the porch as the bus took her away, clutching Lily's hand so tightly it left a mark. The days without Ellie stretched long and strange. And though the house still hummed with life, there was an emptiness in it, like a missing note in a song. And Jacob did what he always did, kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, fixing the chicken coop, helping Lily with her reading, pretending he wasn't checking the mailbox 5 times a day for a letter that never came. Until one morning, nearly 2 months later, a white sedan pulled up the path, and out stepped Ellie, but not the Ellie he remembered. This Ellie wore a tailored coat and heels, her hair slicked back in a way that made her look like every photo he'd ever seen of her mother. And for a moment he froze, terrified that she had gone back for good, that the world she fled had swallowed her whole. But then she smiled, wide, real, bright, and ran barefoot the rest of the way to him, arms around his neck before he could breathe, whispering, "I had to finish what he started so I could finally stop being his daughter." And then she pulled out a stack of documents and dropped them on the porch table. Legal papers showing that the Whitmore estate had been dismantled, assets liquidated, shares donated, money redistributed to the workers and charities. Her father had once exploited, everything else signed away to ensure no child born into that name would ever be burdened by it. Gendang, Jacob, stunned, asked, "All of it?" And she nodded, eyes brimming. "I kept only enough for one thing." And when he asked what, she said, "This land, this home, for us." And Lily screamed when she saw her running down the path like a rocket. And they held each other in a tangle of limbs and tears and joy. And that night, with fireflies dancing outside and the scent of honeysuckle in the air, Jacob finally said what he'd been too scared to say for months: "I love you." And Ellie laughed and replied, "I know, but it's nice to hear it anyway." And from that moment on, there were no more secrets between them. No more ghosts haunting the edge of their happiness because they had survived something rare, not just grief, not just fear, but the temptation to run from the very thing they needed most: each other. They married in the backyard under a crooked arch made from driftwood and wildflowers, with Lily tossing petals like confetti and the town gathered around like a family reborn. And no one cared that Ellie had once been Eleanor Whitmore, because the girl in the white dress with mud on her shoes wasn't an heiress or a runaway. She was just Ellie, the woman who chose love over legacy, a cabin over a castle, and a broken man with a pure heart over a world of empty privilege. Years passed, and the garden grew wild with sunflowers and tomatoes, and the cabin got a new roof and a second bedroom. And Lily grew taller and stronger, and never once stopped calling Ellie Mom. And on summer evenings, they'd sit on the porch with guitars and old stories and root beer floats. She would smile, not just for him, but for the girl who had knocked on his door one freezing night and unknowingly saved them both. And for the life they built, not from wealth or bloodline, but from the simplest, truest thing of all: a second chance.